Okay, so for this session that we're in right now in July, what we're doing is we're bringing together a couple of different frames of reference that are going to be congruent. One is the use of the historical critical method, and the other is the mimetic theory. After we've brought these two together, we are also going to bring in a theological piece, and that's the work of Karl Barth. So we're going to start with the marriage of the historical critical method and mimetic theory. Now, this was done one time back in the early 1990s by Raymond Schwager, and he did this in his book, Jesus and the Drama of Salvation, and made a case for integrating the use of the historical critical method in reading the New Testament in order to discern the difference between what we will now call religion and revelation. And then, of course, the mimetic theory helps that distinguishing capacity, that it brings in the clarity in and around the victim as the first divinized symbol. And next week, we're going to talk at length about this and the importance of it for reading the New Testament. But for now, one of the things we want to do is we want to look at early Christianity. And in this business of early Christianity, what we're looking to do is we're looking to try and, hang on, I'm just moving stuff around here so I can see if anybody comes in. We're just trying to understand what's actually happening as the early church develops. Because most of us have been brought up on early Christian development in terms of the apostles wrote the New Testament and then they died, and then the church eventually got Orthodox bishops and they made the New Testament and they had to fight the heretics, and then basically Christianity arose. And that's how most of us have been taught. And we've also been taught that whatever our Bibles say, in the introductions to all the letters and the books and the Gospels, we just assume it's all true. 90% of what's written in your introductions to your Bibles is just simply false. It's just not true. And so when scholars set about to, when New Testament scholars set about to engage an early Christian timeline, the one thing they have to make a decision on is the relationship between Paul and Jewish Christianity. And as I pointed out previously, that relationship, that relationship took a turn under F.C. Bauer and the Tübingen School at the turn of the 19th century, where Bauer argued that early Christianity must be understood as this conflict between Paul and Jerusalem Christianity. Now, again, as I mentioned previously, there has been a fair number of critical appropriations of this. There have been dismissals of it. The 20th century, late 20th century here has seen kind of a reappreciation for it, minus all the Hegelian philosophical nonsense. And that's largely due to the new perspective on Paul. And I think Doug Campbell's work is beginning to influence this as well. This reappreciation or reappropriation of F.C. Bauer's argument that the entirety of early Christianity, or certainly the vast majority of it, not counting the Johannine Church, can be understood as the relationship between Peter and Paul. Now, Michael Goulder makes hay of this. He has a commentary, as it were, a study of the Corinthian correspondence, and it's simply titled St. Peter versus St. Paul. And Goulder's argument is that the Peter and the Jerusalem church were intent on coming in and correcting Paul's bad gospel, because Paul's bad gospel did not have a mechanism by which Gentiles could eat together with Jews, unless the Gentiles held to certain positions, or until Gentiles, in the more conservative cases, got circumcised. So we have these phenomena, and we know that Paul will have none of this. He will have absolutely none of this. And as we move through the literature of the New Testament, as I've only just begun to make the case, I haven't actually given you the actual exegesis for all this, although you can find it in bits and pieces all over my work. We find that this very phenomenon of Paul versus Peter, or in this sense, Paul versus James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, of which Peter functions as a mascot, as it were. We find that this very disjunction seems to color most of the literature of the New Testament. Not all of it, but most of it. And when we walk into the literature that's produced during this very same time, that is the other Christian literature that's written between the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is between 70 and 135. We find the same phenomenon here. And it all fundamentally boils down to how Christians are going to relate to Judaism and the Old Testament. So there are three battles. The first is the battle for the actual text of the Old Testament. And so there are textual battles, with some claiming the Septuagint, and the Jewish tradition, obviously in the second century is going to begin, allowing the Christians to claim the Septuagint. They're not going to claim it. They're going to claim the Targums and the Hebrew text instead. Then there are translation battles, because where the Jews had to engage Christians on Greek-speaking soil, the Christians wanted to use texts from the Septuagint to justify certain doctrines that they took. So for example, Isaiah 7:14 in the Hebrew text says simply, behold, a young woman, an Alma, will conceive, whereas Isaiah 7:14 in the Septuagint has, behold, a virgin, a Parthenos, will conceive. And so the Christians argued that the Hebrew text was faulty, the Septuagint was correct, and therefore Jesus' birth by the Virgin Mary in Matthew and Luke was a fulfillment of this. And so the Jews came along and they said, no, this is a poor translation, and the whole virgin birth thing is made up. Then there were, in addition to these textual battles and translation battles, there were battles for title. Who has the right to claim this text? Did the Jews have the right to claim the Hebrew scriptures for themselves, or were they in fact deceived? And therefore, only the community that had Christ and the revelation of what those scriptures meant could have those texts. The second battle, in addition to the battle for the Hebrew scriptures, was the battle for orthodoxy. At this time, there are going to be two dominant models and a third model that's not quite as dominant yet in the early second century, although it's going to become rather large by the end of the second century. And the first one is the bishops versus communities where you have presbyters. So if a congregation is ruled by a group of presbyters and deacons, they're not beholden to a bishop. But we already find by 117 the concept of the monarchical episcopate, that is, one bishop in one geographical area over a number of congregations with their elders and presbyters. And there were battles of how churches were to be organized and run between the bishop, the monarchical bishop people, and the presbyters. But in addition to that, there were still communities that were organized around the Holy Spirit. So Steve, you know this. We have the early communities that are led by the Spirit, and these communities have prophecy. They have tongues. They have everything that the modern charismatic movement has, including some pretty rather whacked out millenarian speculation. So if you want to find the phenomenon of the charismatic tradition in the second century, it's there. And it produces a problem for these emerging bishoprics who will have to contend with them. So if we have now three models of how to be church. In addition to that is the whole question now of which bishops have the truth. That is, which bishops could claim apostolic succession in their see, S-E-E, meaning in their geographical region. And so in, for example, Rome, we have a very clear line of succession of bishops, beginning with Peter and including Clement, and then on down through Hyginus and Pius and so on and so forth, Anicetus and others in the 2nd century, all the way down to the present. In other local sees, like Alexandria, we don't have anything for a couple of hundred years, and then boom, boom, the bishoprics, the list starts. What's most intriguing, this is a total aside, it's for those of you that might want to ponder this because I can't find a solution to it, is the fact that when Eusebius, and he's the one we're going to get most of our bishopric lists from, when Eusebius records these at this apostolic succession in his ecclesiastical history, nowhere is Ephesus mentioned. Ephesus, such a major theological center for centuries there, nowhere is there a succession of bishops. And I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious about the Johannine community's role there and perhaps a piece that plays there. Anyway, so you have this how to be church, bishops, presbyters, charismatic leadership. You have the question of apostolic succession. And then you have the problem of Gnosticism. And these all contribute to the battle for orthodoxy. Now remember, there is no New Testament. There is no standardized interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures. There is no orthodoxy at this point. There is no such thing as orthodoxy at this point. There are only a multiplicity, excuse me, of Christianities, all seeking to figure out who is the true church and how is the true church to be governed and authorized. The third battle, in addition to the battle for the text and interpretation of the Hebrew Jewish scriptures, I should say, and the battle for orthodoxy, was the battle for preeminence. And this has to do with a particular decision that was made just prior to the turn of the century. And this would have taken place down in southern Judea after Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai, and then later Rabbi Akiva would establish a school for the study of Torah that would replace going to the temple. So now the way you do atonement, the way you do everything is through study of Torah. And it's at this time that you have around the diaspora, around the Mediterranean, Jews and Christians, Jews, I should say, and Jewish Christians, or Jews, Jewish Christians, and proselytes, Gentile proselytes, all worshiping together. And the Jewish Christians would have created some amount of controversy in some of these or many of these synagogues. And so it's at this time that what's known as the Birkat HaMinim, or the malediction against the heretics, is inserted into the 18 benedictions. And the 18 benedictions are the prayer that's prayed every single Sabbath. Jesus would have prayed an earlier form of this prayer with perhaps 10 or 12 of these benedictions at the end of a service. But Judaism will insert this benediction into the 18 benedictions in the 90s or early 100s, that when the person stood up to offer this blessing over the congregation, it would be a blessing for the congregation and a curse. They're saying, now you're cursing the Minim, the heretics, and the Nazarenes. So a Christian, a Jewish Christian, the way they would ferret them out is if they suspected you were a secret Christian, they would have you come up and do the benedictions. And if you stumbled over those words of cursing your own brothers and sisters in Christ, then they would throw you out of the synagogue. So these 18 benedictions became a form of a litmus test within the synagogue system in the diaspora. And it became one way of demarcating those in the Jewish community who were the Christian troublemakers. Second, in this battle for preeminence. After 70 CE, Jewish Christianity, by and large, is going to shift off and disappear to the east. It's going to head into Syria, what's now Syria, Iraq, Iran, this neck of the woods. Jordan, that you with me outside, it's going to head this way. This also meant that Jewish Christianity, in the form of James and Peter and that tradition, lost a certain degree or a greater degree of its influence on Gentile Christians. This is in the year 70. A generation later, the church outside in the diaspora is predominantly Gentile. It's no longer mixed Jewish and Christian. It's predominantly Christian, with very little Jewish influence in terms of Jewish Christians being part of the Gentile congregations. And this can be recognized in the simple fact that this period has a war at the beginning. Then it's an 8-year war from 66 to 74. Even though the temple and Jerusalem are crushed in 70, this war doesn't end until Masada in 74. It's an 8-year war. And it's at the beginning, or rather as the temple is being crushed, that Mark's gospel is being written. And it is at the end of this process, I suspect, that Matthew's gospel begins to be written. But then there's another war that takes place in the diaspora, not in the Holy Land, but in the diaspora, in a number of geographic areas where diaspora Jews will rebel against Rome. And it's very, very bad in Alexandria, Egypt. And the Jewish community there, which was the largest Jewish community outside of Palestine, staged a major revolt and slaughtered, I mean, just slaughtered Roman troops. I couldn't give you the numbers or the number of legions or units that were slaughtered, but they did a mass slaughter. And of course, Rome will come down very, very hard on them. This is a 3-year war from the year 115 to 117. It's known as the Kitos War, K-I-T-O-S, after a kind of a phonetic spelling of the general Lucian Quietus, Q-U-I-E-T-U-S, Quietus. We would say Quietus, but it's Quietus. And that's named after him for stopping that rebellion. And then finally in 132, under the direction of Simeon Bar Kokhba and under the authorization of Rabbi Akiva, that revolt begins. And it is so massive a revolt in the Holy Land that when Hadrian comes along and prosecutes that war, he razes the entire city of Jerusalem. So the Gentile church at this point, from 70 to 135, this 65-year period, has problems because A, there are those trying to claim that Christianity comes out of Judaism, and then there are those Gentiles going, no, we really don't want to be a part of this troublesome people that's having trouble with the government and getting us persecuted. You with me? Are you with me on this? Okay. So the question is, where was the story to begin? How do we tell this thing called the Christian story? Do we start it off with Genesis or Moses or David? Do we start it off even with the story of this creator God working with Israel and revealing God's self? And then we have a culmination of it in the New Testament. What's the relationship of this emerging phenomenon known as the Christian church, predominantly Gentile, and its Jewish antecedents? And so there are going to be any number of ways that this problem is going to be solved. One of the ways that you can see this is in the Epistle to Barnabas. And the Epistle to Barnabas is in the Apostolic Fathers. And it is written, it's a Roman book. It's written from Rome. And The interesting thing about this book is it's constantly quoting the scriptures, especially the prophets, over against Judaism. In other words, this writer is the writer that says, hey there, these texts, this tradition of which we are the true heirs, can be proven because even the prophets said that the people of God didn't hear God's promises. Therefore, God broke God's promise to Israel, gave it to the church, and now we are the people of God. That's one solution, isn't it? And have you heard this before, taught anywhere? It's a form of supersessionism. Another can be found in the Epistle to Diognetus, which is literally one of my favorite texts. And when I wrote my earliest article on the early church and mimetic theory back, I think it was 1988, I wrote it. I had the reading I have in there, the mimetic reading is very good, but there is something I want to read to you that I thought was absolutely brilliant on the Epistle to Diognetus. Okay, this is from Badun's book on the First New Testament. The letter to Diognetus goes even further in criticizing the Jewish tradition in a manner unqualified by any claim that Christianity is a truer Judaism, repeatedly emphasizing the newness of Christianity instead of the more typical claim that it was something ordained from old. Now, remember, the newness, the word new, is a very favorite of Marcion's. It's a very favorite. And whereas a lot of the church is going to be talking about how the new was actually to be found in the old, here's the little letter of Diognetus, along with Marcion, not of course connected, but in the same period of time, making this case. According to the author, no one had any knowledge of God before the coming of Christ. And God held back his, quote, own wise counsel as a well-guarded mystery, unquote. The author concedes that the one God is the creator and that the Jews worship this God, but they misunderstand his character. And friends, I fail to understand why a text like this, the Epistle to Diognetus, which raises the same question that Marcion did, this becomes part of Orthodox Christianity. Marcion doesn't. But they raised the same question. It had to do fundamentally with two pieces. One, the character of God. Was God only loving and benevolent and kind, or was God also just or vengeful? The second question was, what kind of Messiah was Jesus? Because one of the things Marcion very clearly does is he rejects the concept of a warrior Messiah. He says the Jews and the creator God, their God, they have a just God who uses anger and violence and all of this, and they are also being promised a violent Messiah. Since Jesus is not a violent Messiah, he cannot be the Messiah of Judaism. He has to be rather the son of the spiritual God, the Father, the one Paul calls the Father. And this is Marcion's logic in this. He cannot have a violent God or a violent Jesus. And now you begin to understand why those of us that engage mimetic theory and refuse to acknowledge a violent God or a violent Jesus are often called Marcionites. But we'll get to in a minute why that is not the case. We also have at this time Ignatius, who's Bishop of Antioch. In the end of his life, around the year 117, he's arrested, and he's going to be taken from Antioch to Rome. And on this journey, he'll make two stops in particular, where he's going to write a little flurry of 3 letters at one point and 4 at another. And he's going to write to the church at Ephesus, and he's going to write to the church at Tralles, and to the church of Magnesia, and Philadelphia, and Smyrna, where Polycarp is bishop. And then he's also going to write a letter to his friend Polycarp. And some of you know that name. You're familiar with Polycarp's name. But even Ignatius in his letters, and particularly the Magnesians and the Trallians, refers to Judaism as old and uses the Greek term old, archai, or we get the word archaic. He uses that term in a very pejorative and derogative manner. So even for Ignatius from Antioch, where the Gospel of Matthew reigns supreme, he is still going to refer to Judaism as old. In addition to that, we have some literature that is probably written in the early to mid 3rd century, that is in the 200s. But it contains within itself another text or oral tradition. I think it's a text called the Kyrigmata Petru, which can be traced back to the middle of the 2nd century. And in this literature from the Pseudo-Clementines, this Kyrigmata Petru comes out of Jewish Christianity. And in that literature, Peter and Paul are set side by side, and Peter is the hero and Paul is the Antichrist. So if in Marcion system you have Paul is the hero and Peter is the Antichrist, in strict Jewish Christianity, Peter's the hero and Paul's the Antichrist. And what is it that the group in between is trying to do? They're going to try and rescue both Peter and Paul. And this rescue process will take place under and with the authority of the Roman Church, because as I said before, the Roman Church contains, or so they allege, the authority and the bodies of Peter and Paul. Now, in addition to this, we have Justin Martyr around the year 150, and he is very, very much oriented. Now remember, Justin Martyr is a Samaritan. He begins life as he's Jewish, he's Samaritan. Then he ends up going into all these philosophical traditions and ends up as a Christian. In his view, there is a continuity between the story of Israel and that of Jesus, and that is promise and fulfillment. And we've talked about this before, and we'll talk about it again, because there is a way of understanding promise and fulfillment that is sadly completely out of step with how Judaism understands promise and fulfillment. And so if you use promise and fulfillment incorrectly, you're basically going to end up in the same place as the epistle to Barnabas, and that's to say that God has blinded the eyes of the Jews, and he's given sight to the Christians, and the Christians are the only proper interpreters of the Jewish canon. Now, in addition to all of this literature that's being produced between 90 and 135, and we've only just scratched the surface, we haven't even talked about the Shepherd of Hermes. Boy, though, I tell you what's funny, how many of you have ever read the Shepherd of Hermes? Got some hands here? What I get a kick out of, I was rereading The Shepherd this week, and it reminded me of a made-for Netflix movie that's made for people, how they make movies, you know, for Netflix or Hulu or whatever. And they want to give it an R rating, you know, to attract people. So at the very beginning, they put in some kind of nudity so they can get the R rating, and then the rest of the film, you don't have that. Well, that's how The Shepherd of Hermes starts. Starts off chapter 1, I was down by the river and I saw this naked woman. It's like, this is hilarious, early Christian porn, you know. Sorry, that was a terrible aside, probably had nothing to do with anything. So we have two other pieces of literature written during this time. One is the Book of Acts, and the second are the pastorals. And here's where I want to now integrate a couple of theses with this larger piece of the attempt to recover or discover the historical Paul. So already in the 2nd century, this is what's happening. Who was Paul? The question about who was Jesus wasn't settled, but it was more settled in as much as there didn't seem to be any negative reaction to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The only negative reactions really going to come against the Gospel of John in the 2nd century. But it was certainly the Apostle Paul who was problematic. Now, the pastorals, when you go read Timothy and Titus, you will notice that there's very, very little in Timothy and Titus that you find in Paul's authentic letters. Very, very little. Second, you find a fair amount in the pastorals that's at odds with Paul's letters. Examples. Number one, the question about women in worship, which Paul articulates in 1 Corinthians as absolutely appropriate, but by the time you get to the pastorals, Paul says, let a woman be silent in church. And it's very difficult to understand why in the year 51, Paul would tell the Corinthians it's fine for women to speak in the church, but just a few years later, he's telling Timothy, just shut the women up. This is a later phenomenon where women leaders in the early 2nd century from these more charismatic Pauline traditions will create problems for those that think only men belong in leadership. And this type of Pauline trajectory can be found in this little apocryphal New Testament book called the Acts of Paul, or the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And in these Acts of Paul, you have Paul encouraging women to leave their husbands behind, to live as though they're virgins, a very ascetic lifestyle, you know, and of course that pisses off a lot of the husbands who a fair enough chunk of the Acts of Paul is about these husbands that come after Paul and give him trouble. But the point is, there was obviously female leadership in these churches, and it was causing problems for these hierarchical, male-oriented only leaders. And in the pastorals, you're also going to find references to Jewish fables and old wives' tales. And this is something that also comes from this frame of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, where it's the women who are passing on the correct Pauline tradition, while the men are in a sense giving Paul a haircut. So the pastorals, from my perspective, are another attempt to reclaim Paul. So you have Marcion, you have the pastorals, and in addition to all this other literature that's trying to fit together Christianity and Judaism, you finally get to the book of Acts. And here's what I find most intriguing. The book of Acts, according to Joseph Tyson in his book on Marcion and the book of Acts, is very, very clearly a very, how do I say this properly? It's both. It contains both a lot of useful historical information, and at the same time, it's a very tendentious approach to those sources. And what do I mean by this? So when scholars read the book of Acts, they go, hey, when you look at chapters 1 through 13, it looks to us like we have a source from the Jerusalem church. And then later on, beginning in, I believe it's chapter 16, the writer has been saying, and they, and they, and they, and then all of a sudden it shifts to, and we, and we, and we. And so scholars will say, what we have here is someone that's kept a diary, a journal of their travels with Paul. It's a travel log. This is especially apparent in chapter 27. Chapter 27 is a master class in sailing the Mediterranean in storms. And it uses over 300 nautical terms not found anywhere else in the New Testament, and rarely even in Greek literature, except for maritime literature. I mean, it's as though somebody was on the boat talking about how they just tacked back and forth up and around the coastline. It's an amazing piece of history. But that doesn't mean the author, in using his sources, didn't feel like he had to stick with them. We see the same thing with Josephus, and that the writer of Luke and Acts has borrowed from Josephus. I don't think there can be any doubt. Josephus writes his Antiquities and Histories around 93, and the preface to the Gospel of Luke 1:1 through 4 is virtually identical with that of Josephus. And so both these writers are going to be writing histories, Josephus in the 90s, Luke in the teens of the next century. Both of these are writing histories of their religious tradition, and both of them, Josephus for the Jews, Luke for the early church, are going to write a tendentious history. They're going to write a history with a slant, a history where they're intending to create a perspective. For Josephus, that perspective in 93 is that the sectarian element of Judaism doesn't represent true Judaism. It's the Pharisees who are the real heroes of Josephus' story. And they represent true Judaism, not the zealot types. And for Luke, the writer of Acts, I think it's Luke, same writer as the Gospel, Luke is very concerned to show that the early church was a great big homogenized community. And he does this in the first 4 chapters, simply talking about the Jerusalem church and how they broke bread from house to house and listened to the apostles and sang, Hillsong songs, and they were all happy, clappy, yay, we love Jesus, And that's the impression you get. You get this feeling from the book of Acts that they become almost communistic in their economics. Everybody just contributes to a pot and everybody gets whatever they need. But this fairy tale, and it is a fairy tale, is false. And the proof of that comes in chapter 5, where you have that incredible scapegoating story of Ananias and Sapphira, and Peter calling judgment down on them because they didn't give their money. And then in Acts chapter 6, where there is a split between the Hebrew or Aramaic speaking Christians, those that are going to be more Torah observant and temple observant, and the Hellenists who aren't. So this happy clappy thing Luke does in chapters 1 through 4, it doesn't even last a year. Because if Jesus dies in April of 33 and Paul is converted in chapter 9 in October of 34, that's an 18-month period from chapter 1 to chapter 9. And chapter 6, if you do the midway point, that's 1 year. Happy clappy Christianity did not last. Because one group decided that they were favored. The Jewish group decided they were favored. The money collected would go to their widows. The out group, the Greek-speaking Christians who had come from around the parts of the world to visit Jerusalem, and they were attending the synagogue in Jerusalem. This has been uncovered archaeologically. The synagogue of these Hellenistic or diaspora Jews, their widows and the Christians in that community that come out of that, their widows aren't being taken care of. Second, Paul is very, very clear. He was given the commission to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. And Peter was given a commission to bring the gospel to the Jews. That's the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians. However, in the book of Acts, immediately after the conversion of the apostle of Saul into the Apostle Paul, immediately after that, who is it that gets a vision to go visit a Gentile? And the sheet is thrown down and all the wild animals are on it. No, I can't eat, I can't eat, I can't eat. I eat them all, eat them all, eat them all. I can't eat, I'm a Jew, I can't eat them all, eat them all. This is Peter. Now, is it conceivable that Peter in Acts chapter 10 has a vision from God where he's told to eat everything? And then some 15 years later, when he's at Antioch and men from James come, and say, Peter, you cannot eat with this unkosher stuff with these Gentile Christians. Does it make sense to you? That Peter says, you're right. James has more authority than the Father does in my life. Does it make sense to you? It doesn't to me. It seems to me that the whole Cornelius story is made up out of whole cloth. It's, in other words, it's not history. It's not historical. It's an attempt to make Peter look like Paul. In the same way, when you go to the latter part of the book of Acts in particular, you have Paul coming in and participating in all of these rituals in the temple system itself. You're getting a Nazirite haircut and these kinds of things, for crying out. And it's almost as though Paul said, I'm going to go behave like a fundamentalist for a while and fool them all. I mean, that Paul does not fit the Paul of the letters at all, nor do his speeches when you have Paul talking about the importance of doing these kinds of things. And then in Acts 15, you have this council, and whether it's the same council as that recorded in Galatians 2, which most think is the case, what we have is a real problem here, because Paul is at this council where this letter is written. And in this letter, drafted by James Peter, the Jerusalem church, this letter has, yeah, happy to have you all join us, but we got basically 4 commandments. No porneia, no blood, no strangled meat, and something else, whatever it was. 4 rules, the Noahide rules. You got to abide by these. Now, first of all, Paul never once in his letters suggests that this minimal Noahide rules worked for Gentiles, although there were others in Judaism, even before Jesus' time, that argued that Gentiles don't have to follow the Torah from Moses, they just have to follow these minimal commandments that go back to Noah. That's why they're called Noahide rules. And so now you have these rules, but Paul never alludes to them. And second, in the later part of the book of Acts, around chapter 25 or 26, when Paul is in Jerusalem and he is visiting with James, James says to him, by the way, just so you know, we sent a letter. As though Paul wasn't there in Acts chapter 15. So there's these editorial issues going on in the book of Acts, but for the most part, what we see is a rehabilitation of the Apostle Paul. Paul is the hero of Acts. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, there is this blending of the Peter and Paul traditions so that they really start looking more like one and another. And this way, the writer in the 2nd century can say, hey, look, the early church had their act together. They were all one. Peter and Paul were one. They were all given the same mission. They all looked the same. They all smelled the same. We need to also. And in that sense, the book of Acts has deceived Christians for 2,000 years who treated it as history and did not recognize the tendencies or trajectories of the writer. But the book of Acts also has a fair number of things in common with the pastorals, if they're written at the same time. We see hierarchical leadership being established in the book of Acts, first with the category of apostles. What's really interesting here is that Paul is never called an apostle in the book of Acts. He doesn't fit the category. An apostle has to be one of the 12, and those 12 have to have been around since the start of Jesus' ministry with John the Baptist. And Paul doesn't fit that bill. And of course, we know the problems Paul had with referring to himself as an apostle, calling these fellows pseudo-apostles, and they're denying him his apostleship because he did not know the historical Jesus. So this is what the 70s to 130s are looking like. This is the stage at which Marcion's going to come on the scene and try and solve the problem. And what Marcion's going to do in solving this problem is Marcion is going to, for the first time, take a gospel and some letters and put them together. The Gospel of Luke and Paul's authentic letters, the 10 letters, not the pastorals. They hadn't been written yet. They're going to be written against Marcion, but right now, this is what Marcion's doing, putting this gospel and these letters together. Marcion creates the first canon or standard by which to measure whether something is gospel or not. In other words, you may have had a New Testament eventually, but you don't have a New Testament, I think, without Marcion. You don't have it as fast. Marcion's the genius behind this concept. And what he's going to do is he's going to make an argument that's very similar to the one that F.C. Bauer makes, that Doug Campbell makes, that I'm making. It's going to be similar in argument to that of Bart Ehrman, for those of you that know Bart Ehrman's textual critical work, and that's this. Here's what Marcion argues. We indeed have this Gospel of Luke, and we do have these letters of Paul. However, it's also the case that this gospel that was written, and we'll just say by Luke, and these letters that Paul wrote, well, when they were passed on, they were corrupted by Jewish influence. And so Marcion is going to be a good textual editor, and he's going to go along and he's going to excise those things in the gospel and in the letters of Paul that he believes were added to the actual letters and gospel themselves. In this sense, he's no different than Bart Ehrman, who today claims that when you go to the Greek textual tradition, it's in such bad shape you'll never get back to an original text, because the Orthodox Church reworked the manuscripts to make them more and more and more and more orthodox, which they did. And we see this in the Masoretic tradition, where after the Talmuds are put in place in the 5th and 6th centuries, already by the 9th century, the Masoretes have standardized the Hebrew text with its vowel points. That's what religions do. They start out messy and then they standardize. And we see this in house churches. They start out messy and then they standardize. Everything does. So this is what Marcion's doing. He's bringing together this gospel and this epistles purged of additions. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a class I've taught on 2 Corinthians, but in 2 Corinthians, beginning in chapter 6:14, I believe it is, and going down to chapter 7, verse 1 or 2, there is no textual apparatus in the world that shows a text critical issue here. But when you look at that text in 2 Corinthians, 6:14 to 7:2, it does not belong. It's something that comes from, or I should say, it sounds like it comes from something out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Go read that text. And the text gets broken up where Paul says, let us in your hearts. And then 7:2, he says, open your hearts. And in the middle, you get this whole Jesus versus Belial, light, darkness, hyper dualism. It just doesn't belong there. And I think that's this. I'm making the same move with regard to that text that Marcion was making with regard to texts he wanted to excise, because he perceived in them some Jewish influence. So let's ask, what was it exactly? What can we say about Marcion? What is it that Marcion believed? I'm going to read you the summary found in John Knox's book, Marcion in the New Testament. It's the best summary, and it goes like this. Now, again, as I'm reading these, it's going to be very important for you to ask how many of them you affirm. You ready? The creator God of the world, although a real God, must be distinguished from the higher God, unknown, except as he was in Christ. The creator of the world, although a real God, must be distinguished from the higher God, unknown, except he was revealed in Christ. Most of us, if we're smart, are going to say no to this. We believe that the creator and the redeemer are one. So we're going to make a different move theologically than Marcion was able to make. We're going to come back and exegete these. Number two, the creator of the world is a just God, but severe and harsh. The God whom Christ revealed is a father, a God of love. Most of us can go, yeah. Basically, the creator God, the God of the Jewish scriptures, he's a just God. He's just, but he does get pissed off and let you have it. Whereas the New Testament, the Father is all about love. So Marcion is onto something there. Number three, judgment is the prerogative of the creator. That is, the creator engages in judgment, but redemption is the free gift of the God of love. Most of us would go, yeah, we could see that. Number four, the Jewish scriptures represent a true revelation of the creator, but they do not speak of or for the God whom alone Christians ought to worship and from whom salvation from the present wicked world is to be received. I'm going to read that again. Do you affirm or do you deny this? Listen carefully. The Jewish scriptures represent a true revelation of the creator, but they do not speak of or for the God whom alone Christians ought to worship and from whom alone salvation from the present world is to be received. If you're torn betwixt and between, it's because there's a portion of it that I think we can affirm, but there's also a portion of it we have to deny. Number five, the revelation in Christ was intended not merely to supplement or fulfill Judaism, but to entirely displace it. The one had no connection with the other. That's a tough one, because it depends on how you're going to understand the term Judaism. Number six, the Son of the Father did not actually take flesh, but only appeared to do so. The Son of the Father did not actually take upon himself sinful flesh, but only appeared to do so. Now, if you say yes to that, you're a heretic, you're a docetic. It means that the word did not become flesh, it just pretended to be flesh. And in that case, you'll have to throw the epistle to the Hebrews out of your canon. Number seven, Marcion said there's no resurrection of the flesh. There's no resurrection of the flesh. For Marcion, the resurrection of Jesus was a spiritual resurrection. In this sense, Marcion is an early progressive Christian, like our friends today, like Marcus Borg and so many others that want to say the resurrection of Jesus is simply spiritual. It's not physical. Number eight, Paul was the only true apostle to whom Christ committed his gospel. Other apostles were false and had misled the church. This last one is a bugaboo, because Paul himself in his letters distinguishes between himself and either the emissaries or missionaries from Jerusalem church, like he does in the letter to the Galatians, where he just excoriates them, or same thing in Philippi, chapter 3, Philippians 3, or again in the Corinthian correspondence, where he's referring most likely to Peter and James when he calls them pseudo-apostles. There is a break between Paul and Jerusalem Christianity. That break is effected in Antioch in 48. It's chronicled in Paul's letters in 50, 51, and 52. That break is what creates the conundrum that exists now in the post-destruction of the temple period to the Bar Kokhba revolt. Paul's intentional break and redefining of the gospel, apart from the Jewish Christian leadership that claimed to have walked and talked with Jesus, was such a drastic break that it's going to affect everything from that point on. Next week, we're going to look at the early church fathers and how they responded to Marcion, and how, just as Marcion had, we're going to look at some of these theological moves Marcion makes. We're going to look at how they responded. And we're going to see that Marcion is really spot on when it comes to the real problem that has plagued Christianity from the start. It plagued Paul, and it will always plague authentic Christians. And if it's not plaguing you, then you really have yet to discover the gospel, or the church does, I should say. And we're going to see how they all give wrong answers. And we're going to especially get into Tertullian, and I'll leave it at that, and I'll end the recording. I've been on quite long enough now.